An autumn breeze carried the fresh smell of water as Isaac Turner walked across the deck. He looked over the railing at the ship sailing down the Detroit River. There was a chill in the air, and he considered going below deck for his jacket, but decided to check on the young man first. He looked around the 700-foot freighter and tried to find his charge. But before he saw Jimmy, he saw something else that brought a smile to his lips. There on the banks of Belle Isle, a jewel in the center of the river between Detroit, Michigan, USA, and Windsor, Ontario, Canada, he saw them. A group of small children were waving as hard as they could to a ship passing by. The group of smiling little faces brought a smile to Isaac's weather-weary face as he watched them. He knew that at this moment each of these children wanted to be on the ship. Tomorrow, their thoughts would return to music, monsters, and video games. But for that brief moment when the ship sailed by, they were completely focused on it. That was the beauty of children. Isaac knew this from experience, for he had two children of his own. They put their hearts into everything they did. If only adults could do the same. "Hey, Ike, who you taking a swing at?" Jimmy asked from behind Isaac. "Just a bunch of kids on the beach," replied Isaac. "Why?" Jimmy asked. "I probably made their day by just being polite," replied Isaac. "Besides, what goes around comes around. You never know. Maybe one of these kids will grow up to be our next mate or owner. I always try to treat people the way I would like to be treated. All the nasty things you do usually come back to you. Good things come back to you too." Jimmy nodded his head and shuddered in the breeze. It was definitely chilly today, even for late October in Michigan, but at least it wasn't snowing. Michigan was a state where all four seasons completely coincided. The weather in the state was also subject to drastic and violent changes. There is an old saying in Michigan, "If you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes and it will change." The vessel on which they both worked as deck laborers was called the Bill Maitland. Its identification and shipping number was DQS-1. It was 729 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 38 feet high. The vessel was carrying iron ore to ports in Michigan and Wisconsin. At this point, its belly held about 26,000 tons of pellets that would soon be used to make cars and trucks. "Damn, it's cold out here," Jimmy muttered. This was his third trip on the ship, and he was starting to get used to it. Sometimes he liked to brag about his knowledge of the ship so the old-timers wouldn't treat him like a newbie. "If I didn't know better, I'd swear the mind—" Isaac cut off the rest of Jimmy's words, clamping a huge hand over the young man's mouth so fast that Jimmy thought he'd eaten the rest of the sentence. "Shut up, boy," Isaac hissed angrily. "You never mention Hira anywhere near the lakes. You especially don't mention her in October and November. Do you understand me?" Isaac stared so intently into Jimmy's eyes that Jimmy became afraid. Jimmy knew that Isaac was big and strong enough to rip him in half without a second thought. That said, Isaac was the kindest and gentlest man Jimmy had ever met. It took something miraculous or very serious to trigger his friend's anger. Jimmy nodded his head, letting Isaac know that he understood him completely. Jimmy knew that sailors, or mariners as they were now called because very few ships traveled these days, were very superstitious. On the Great Lakes, those superstitions only seemed to be intensified. But with all the technological advances and modern equipment, Jimmy didn't expect anyone to actually believe in all these old tales. Perhaps it was just the generation gap making itself felt again. There was more than just a generation gap between 50-year-old Ike and 24-year-old Jimmy. They had almost no common life experiences to bring them together. In fact, the only thing they had in common was that they had both been deck sailors on a DQS-1 ship. Other than that, their lives were no different. While Jimmy met a new woman in every port they visited, his friend Isaac had been married to the same woman, Tina, for longer than Jimmy had been alive. Their relationship was often stormy, and more than once Jimmy had to calm Ike down. Almost everyone on the ship knew about Ike and his wife's constant bickering. That was one of the reasons Jimmy didn't want to settle down until he went to sea. It was too hard to maintain a stable relationship while away from home for weeks at a time. Ike argued that they stayed together because they loved each other. But Jimmy, listening to the couple's almost constant bickering, often wondered what love had to do with it. Besides, Ike still adhered to many superstitious omens that had long since become part of seafaring lore. Jimmy, on the other hand, was not religious or superstitious. He didn't believe in anything that couldn't be seen, felt, or tasted. Even most things he heard could be explained scientifically. One of his favorite shows that he watched at every opportunity on the internet, Ghostbusters, showed that many things that people thought were supernatural in origin were actually very easily explained. So Jimmy just laughed inwardly at how his friend was afraid Jimmy would mention a witch. A witch, Jimmy thought to himself. Witch. Screw the witch, Jimmy said quietly to himself as Isaac walked away. Next chapter. Even though Jimmy's nearly silent words were too quiet to be heard by human ears, they still echoed in the water of the river and became part of it. As they became part of the river, they became part of Lake Huron, into which it flowed. Jimmy's words traveled through the St. Mary's River and the Sioux Locks into Lake Superior. Lake Superior, by surface area, is the largest freshwater lake in the world. Both Longfellow and Gordon Lightfoot wrote about Gitch Gumi, which means big water. Whatever you call it, Lake Superior is big and scary. There are areas deep in the lake where the water doesn't freeze for most of the year. Local superstitions said that the lake and its sisters were living things with spirits and personalities. There were all sorts of legends surrounding the lakes and their abilities. In Jimmy's case, the problem was not the spirit of the 10,000-year-old lake. The problem was something much younger, but also much older. Deep in the center of the lake, in one of the coldest parts of the lake that was so cold it was called the Ice Water Mansion, the ripple of Jimmy's words caressed the body. One touch of the water filled with words was enough. The creature hissed, and eyes of an eerie icy blue color opened. A thin hand swung, and the wind at the top of the lake surged upwards, creating a whirlpool that cut deeply into the lake. The rushing current did not go unnoticed by the Supreme herself. In a voice as deep and watery as the ocean, the Supreme One uttered, "Sleep, little sister. Your time has not yet come." In response, the wind howled in the lake, and a whirlpool cleared a path for her body to the surface of the water. Something is calling to me, and I must answer. The force of the wind increased until her exhausted but bloated body broke to the surface and floated above the water. Thunder rumbled and lightning struck the water. The gusts of wind reached gale force and formed a very tight arc around the body. The suction and friction of the wind pulled all the water out of the body. The lake water acted as a preservative, keeping the body fresh. As the body dried, the wind rushed in. The body became the abode of the wind's consciousness. In a very strange way, the body became the receptacle of the wind. It allowed the wind to interact with beings and entities on the earth plane, while remaining tethered to the incorporeal plane on which she and her cousins, the spirits of the lakes, existed. Wind and lakes have always been able to influence people, places, and things on both planes, but knew neither the results nor the motivation for their actions on this plane. Her sister, Superior, often sank ships and killed many without realizing it herself. The body, whose consciousness now belonged to the wind, smiled at the thought of it. She shook her head vigorously. So vigorously, in fact, that if she were still human, her neck would have snapped. Her eyes glowed with unnatural fire and determination. The thoughts that belonged to the original consciousness that this body was in were still swirling around in her head. That person had been dead for over 30 years if you counted time by human standards. She wondered why the thoughts, memories, and feelings of that person still plagued her sometimes. But it didn't matter, she thought. She was no longer Sue Ellen Hopper. It was amazing that she still remembered the man's name. It was November in the yard. People, those frail, useless little creatures, called her the November Witch. They only knew her for the storms she brought with her, waking up every year. They knew so little. For 31 years now, she had had her own purpose among them. Amazingly, no one had guessed it until now. Looking around, Noya Brina felt herself being called toward the shore. The call was coming from the vicinity of Gitchagumi, to where the waters of Guron splashed. She felt the call, and what it promised very keenly. But first she needed to eat. To hell with the witch, really? Next chapter. Clifford Darden slid out from under the back seat of his 2008 Mustang GT. He was working on the car's suspension. He needed stiffer upper and lower control arms so that the rear of the pony car wouldn't bounce every time he hit a bump or pothole. The car had tremendous power, but getting it on the road was no easy task. He wondered why Ford still refused to put independent rear suspension on the car. Heck, most cars come with a limited slip rear differential anyway. So why the hell are they still using a rear axle that is basically an I-beam with a wheel on each end? He didn't care. He loved his car so much that the few flaws in its design seemed more like personality quirks than flaws. Cliff didn't know any perfect human beings. What made him climb out from under the car was the sound of another car parked outside the garage. He realized it was probably his wife Ramona arriving. He wiped his hands and entered the house just in time to see the attractive blonde run up the stairs and head straight for the bathroom adjacent to their bedroom. She'd been doing that a lot lately. It seemed she had to take a shower every night when she first got home. He wondered what she was doing at her secretarial job, which was so stressful that she needed to shower right after she got home. It wasn't what he signed up for when he married her. He didn't understand why she needed to work at all. His six-figure salary was more than enough to provide for both of them. Ramona's job didn't bring her enough income to pay for the clothes he bought her to wear to work. He had convinced her several times that in terms of saving them money, she was better off quitting her job. The cost of the clothes she needed for work, in addition to her regular clothes, plus the wear and tear on her car and gasoline were all far more than she was making. When you add in the lunches she ate at her favorite restaurant every day, it worked out that they were losing money on her job. He respected her desire to work and maintain a semblance of economic independence, but this was getting out of line. They had been married just under 2 years and were already starting to fall apart in the bedroom. Cliff loved Ramona. As soon as he saw her, he fell in love immediately. His heart lay at her feet, and she could do whatever she wanted to him. Cliff wasn't a troll, but he wasn't Romeo either. He expected her to stomp his heart into the ground and walk away laughing. At the very least, he expected her to politely and gently brush him off in search of some guy to sing along to. He was more than pleasantly surprised when she responded to his interest and affection with what appeared to be similar feelings. Their courtship was short but intense. They became engaged after only 3 months, married after 6, and 2 years later were ready for divorce. It had been very painful. Lately, Cliff had been getting more affection from his car than from Ramona. It would be a few more days before he was ready to face her. One way or another, there would have to be an end to this. Of course, he suspected he was having an affair at work. He'd done the usual, including putting an investigator on her. He would report back to him in a few days, but then what? What would he do if it turned out she was having an affair? The macho thing to do would be to throw the bitch out on the street immediately. Throw her out on the street. Maybe he should have been even more macho and beat the shit out of her and the people she cheated with. That's what John Wayne would have done. But the problem was, he wasn't John Wayne. Cliff didn't put up with other people's shit, but that was the reality of life. He loved Ramona so much he couldn't imagine life without her, even after only 2 years. He was torn, but knew that in the end, his only hope was that if he met her face to face and bluffed her into agreeing to give up another man. Spending nights in Ramona's arms, even if she claimed she was too tired to do anything else, was still better than being alone, and certainly better than being with someone else. On the one hand, he wanted Ramona to love him the way he loved her, and on the other hand, he wished with all his heart that he had never met her. One way or another, this would all be over soon. He shrugged and went back to working on the car. Next chapter. She remembered the 4 hours she'd spent that morning in a motel room across town with 3 strange guys. She'd had to wash herself to a shine so Cliff wouldn't guess anything. Cliff's only advantage was his house. It was located in a small, gated community. It was the perfect place to hide out after the insurance scam she'd almost gotten caught in shortly before they'd met. Now, 2 years later, there was still no one looking for her, and she was just about to access Cliff's accounts to squeeze all the blood out of him. When she left him in a few days, she'd be able to pull out nearly $1 million in cash and investments to ease her way into the next scam. What she liked most about Cliff was that he was so damn reliable. With him, she realized that the insurance scams and burglaries she used to make money from were too dangerous and not lucrative enough. What she'd pulled off with him was too good to be true. Just find a rich simpleton, get him to fall in love with her, marry her, hide out with him for a while, then walk away and leave him with no money. It was all too easy. Besides, even though she didn't love him, she had feelings for him, and she didn't want him to suffer unnecessarily. Ramona wasn't really capable of love in the sense that many people understood it. That's why Cliff was the closest person to her. She treated Cliff the way most people treat their pets. "Cliff," she called out to him. She looked around the house and didn't see him. Where the hell was he? As she looked around the house, she realized she was going to miss the place. Cliff had spent money and time making her comfortable in the huge ranch house. She really felt at home here. She had never had a home before, at least her own. She looked at the pictures scattered on the tables and walls. There were many pictures of her and Cliff in different parts of the world. They seemed genuinely happy. Only she knew that their shared memories were only part of her attempts to gain his trust. She heard a light knocking coming from behind the kitchen and realized where he was. He was in the garage with his second wife. She wondered what he would choose, her or the car, if he had a choice. "Cliff!" she called out, opening the door that separated the garage from the house. He tore his gaze away from the mechanical contraption he was working on under the car, and she saw the sadness in his eyes. He knew. Instincts honed by years of scamming told her unmistakably that her mark was watching her. She didn't know exactly how much he knew, but he knew something, and they wouldn't last long. "Hi, honey. I've been thinking about you all day," she cooed. "It's been a few days since we—" "I'm a little tired," he said, looking back at his car. Now she knew he knew. His face reflected jealousy. He suspected she was teasing him. Perhaps he would ask someone to follow her. If they looked too closely, they might discover something. Tonight, she would have to make a run for it. But this early in the game, she wouldn't get all the money. She'd have to settle for a few $100,000. Fortunately, her backup pup would be home tonight. He was a sailor and might be able to sneak her out if she pressed him. She'd already had fun with him on that huge ship he wasn't supposed to take her on. "But baby, don't you want to—" she began. She really wanted to try to save him if possible. The best chance of getting all the money was to convince him to be patient for a few more weeks. Honestly, she hated to admit it, but she really wasn't ready for her relationship with Cliff to end. Yes, he was clueless, but he loved her unconditionally. She hadn't had that before. She would probably miss him more than she would miss home. She painted a look of regret and pain on her face, as if he had hurt her badly. Her game was so good that he was beginning to give up. She almost laughed at it. And then, what happened happened. His cell phone rang. He looked at her apologetically and said, "I have to take this." Ramona knew Cliff like the back of her hand. She had trained him so well that he usually told her everything. If he had a business conversation, he didn't hesitate to discuss it in her presence. But he didn't want to take this call in her presence. It could only mean one of two things. The first was that it was something he didn't want her to know about. The second was that it concerned her directly. Of course, it could have been a surprise he was preparing for her, but it was better to be reassured. She had to assume he knew about her, and this call didn't bode well for her. And she tiptoed over to him as he turned away from her and closed the phone. She kissed him lightly on the cheek and left the room. She pretended to close the door quietly behind her and then dropped the frying pan in the kitchen. The sound traveled throughout the house. She knew he would think she was cooking something to eat. Then she quickly went back to the not completely closed door and listened. She heard him talking about pictures and videos. She couldn't make out the whole conversation, but when she heard his side of the story, she realized her intuition was right. She went back into the kitchen and made herself a sandwich. When Cliff came over to her, she smiled and asked if he wanted to eat something too. "Maybe when I get back," he replied. "I need to talk to you about something too, okay?" She nodded her head and smiled. "I love talking to you, sweetheart," she said. "I'll be waiting." Her smile was so bright, and the way she looked at him told him she was willing to do anything for him. He walked out of the house. He got into his Mustang and drove out of the garage with a clatter. Damn it, she wished he'd driven a different car. This one she would have taken with her in a heartbeat. Before he reached the end of the block, she was already getting dressed and grabbed a few of his credit cards, which she hid. He, like many people, used the same PIN number for all his cards. That way it would be easier for her to empty them. She stashed the cards in her purse and then opened the safe. He usually kept $10,000 to $20,000 in cash in there for emergencies. He also had several easily redeemable CDs. She used all of her credit cards to fund the account and then cashed in the CDs in a neighboring town. In the end, she was left with about $100,000. It wasn't chicken feed, but she didn't have access to large bank accounts yet. She planned to pretend to buy him a very expensive car for his birthday. She had already talked to the man who handled their bank accounts. She was going to give the idiot the impression that she was buying Cliff a Ferrari. That way she'd kill two birds with one stone. The idiot at the bank would get the impression that he was more attractive to her than he was, or could be. He might even get the impression that she might give him something extra for his help. On the other hand, poor silly Cliff might think she was giving him something to eat. He might have thought she didn't know that he would have to give him the money. By the time the car was due, she was long gone. Oh well, next time, next sucker, she thought. She's really going to miss him. He really did love her, and her heart wasn't quite set yet. But she would get over it, they both would. And in a way, she was doing him a favor. She was teaching him a very important lesson. He realized that he had to be much more careful with both his money and his heart. Next chapter. Cliff met with his private detective, Frederick Sanford. "Sit down, Mr. Darden," said Sanford. Fred Sanford was an old, jaded veteran who had gone into the detective business after leaving the army. During his years of service, he had seen all sorts of things. He had seen men who cheated on their wives so often that running after other men's women was like buying a hamburger for them. He'd also seen men who loved the women who cheated on them so much that, even when they caught them, they gave them chance after chance until it became a game of don't ask, don't tell. He was sure Darden would be one of those. The guy loved that bitch so much it was crazy, but who wouldn't? Never. It wasn't much fun telling this guy that the woman he loved was having fun with everyone in her path. "Mr. Darden, I have some bad news for you," Sanford said. He spoke in a professional, sad voice because it made the customers think he really felt their pain. In fact, customers paid better when they thought he was sad for them. "Your wife is definitely playing you. But it's a good thing it's not one special guy. It would have been much worse," Sanford said. "Okay, I'm lost," Cliff said. "Wouldn't it be better if it was just one guy?" "Hell no, much worse," Sanford said. "If she's having fun with one guy all the time, that means she has some feelings. She may like him or even love him. Things like that can be easily fixed. You might even be able to save your marriage. In that case, maybe her attraction is just higher than yours, and instead of trying to hurt your feelings, she just goes out to get what she needs and then comes home to you. When you're together, how does she feel about you?" Sanford asked. "Well, she feels good about me," Cliff replied. He was beginning to realize that this was not the case at all as he had previously thought. Perhaps things weren't so unequivocal. "She just lights up when I walk into the room." "Well, that's it," Sanford said. "Take this folder. Go home and show her the pictures and videos. Scare the hell out of her. Make her think you want a divorce and get counseling to help you get through it." Cliff's mood brightened noticeably as he headed home. Next chapter. Jimmy laid down on his bunk for a short nap after helping the other deck workers unload most of the cargo. It was hard physical labor and very tiring. He had time for a short nap before he called Melissa, his woman in town. She was a few years older than him, but so beautiful that it didn't matter. Jimmy also knew she was married, and that didn't matter to him either. Despite having a large crane to lift most of the cargo, Jimmy and the other deck laborers and dock crew did hours of grueling work unloading the ship. They moved 13,000 tons of pellets and loaded almost as many raw castings. Both the castings and the remainder of the pellets will go to Wisconsin with the ship. They will leave for Wisconsin in the morning, so Jimmy will only be able to meet Melissa for one night. On the way back, he'll stop for 3 days, and then maybe they'll have a real date. But tonight was just to take the edge off. "Jimmy, there's some broad waiting for you," Carl Jones called out. Carl was another deck sailor. He had been on the ship only a few weeks longer than Jimmy. Carl had a reputation for being a weasel. Most of the crew had already decided he wasn't such a bad guy, unless you trusted him with something you didn't want to lose. Also, Carl seemed willing to break any rule he thought he could get away with. "Do you want me to bring her to your room?" Carl asked. "Hell no," said Jimmy. "The captain will kill us both." "The old man's ashore. What he doesn't know won't hurt him," Carl hummed. "All right, bring her down," Jimmy yawned. 10 minutes later, Ramona, whom Jimmy knew as Melissa, was having fun with Jimmy. He considered him the best lover she had ever had. He truly believed that she missed him so much that she was waiting for him at the marina when she really needed to convince him to take her to Wisconsin that night or early the next morning. She was sure the stolen money would have the police and his private investigator looking for Cliff. And while Cliff could afford to lose it, if she were caught, That amount of money would send her to prison for a very long time. And she noticed at once that it was as if he was pulling away from her. She realized at once that, unlike Cliff, Jimmy didn't want intimacy with her. He had had his fill and no longer needed her. That put her in a quandary. She needed to hide and get out of town at the same time. She should have waited until they moved farther away from the dock. She was in his power now, and she essentially had nothing to bargain for except the promise of getting more of what he had already gotten. She realized what she had done was very foolish. She had gone and stolen from the man who truly loved her with all his heart and soul. And what was in it for her? She got some money. He always gave her as much money as she wanted. Cliff was handsome and sweet and rich. What more could she ask for? She would soon be 30. She was getting too old for all this running and hiding from the law. Wasn't it time for her to settle down and have all the things we all have? It was too late this time, but it was time for her to find her own life and stop stealing other people's pieces. "Jimmy, I missed you so much," she lied. Jimmy yawned and looked at his watch. "I wouldn't want you to be late, babe," he said. Baby, she thought. That bastard probably doesn't even remember the name she gave him. The funny thing was, she didn't remember either. "What's my name, Jimmy?" she asked. He started. She growled angrily. "Melissa," he muttered quickly. "I haven't forgotten. I'm just used to calling you baby." "Jimmy, can I stay with you? I don't want us to be separated for so long again," she asked, and her voice sounded very innocent and very needy. "I'll think about whether I can do that," he said. "You'll have to be very quiet and very careful because I could be in serious trouble if we get caught. I don't know how you'll be able to wash yourself or even go to the bathroom." "Don't worry about that, Jimmy," she purred. "I just want to be with you, okay?" Ramona planned to do the same thing she always did. A ship full of men wouldn't be a problem. They'd get to Wisconsin in less than 3 days, even if the ship moved slowly, so all she needed was a chance and a place to hide. Jimmy had his own ideas, too. Besides, her husband was rich. If he was nice to her, maybe she could get him a job. Unlike Ike, Jimmy wasn't going to be loading and unloading this ship for the rest of his damn life. "Okay, baby, we'll give it a shot. Why don't you go get your stuff and bring it back here? Meet me in 3 hours at the same place you were waiting for me earlier," he said. "You won't regret it, Jimmy," she said. 3 hours was just about right. She had already been to the bank and transferred as much money as she could from Cliff's account. Now all she had to do was run to as many ATMs as she could until she'd exhausted her limit there, too. Adding cash and CDs to the mix, she was in very good shape. However, one thought flashed in the back of her mind. It was very persistent and at the same time very persistent. "It doesn't have to be like this. He loves you very much. He will forgive you and you will both be happy." She brushed the thought away. It was beyond her. She'd been on the run most of her life, stealing and cheating people, so why change now? She wasn't sure she knew how to live any other way. Next chapter. Jimmy walked into a dirty little riverside bar called Sailor's Hands. As he looked around the room, he saw a few guys playing pool, a few more throwing darts, and a few more gathered in front of a shabby TV watching a Red Wings game. He was surprised that Detroit was such a big sports town. Even New York or any city in California didn't have the variety of sports teams that the Motor City had. The Red Wings were arguably the best team in the NHL. The Tigers battled the Rangers in the ALCS to determine who would advance to the World Series. The Lions started the year an incredible 4-0. They have won 8 straight regular season games dating back to last year, and 12 straight if you count the preseason. This weekend's soccer games were between Michigan and Michigan State. Everywhere you looked, there were great sporting events taking place. Only the Pistons sucked. Sailor's Arms was not a bar designed for an elite clientele. The wood was old and the furniture was beat up. The floors were scuffed and the place didn't serve food, only drinks and appetizers. Most of the customers were sailors working on the Great Lakes. None of the customers dressed up because women rarely came into the place. And if they did, they were usually either lost or trying to drag a drunken husband home. But even in those 2 cases, they left as fast as they could. It was as if they sensed they didn't belong here. Maybe that's why it was so strange when a strong gust of wind swung the door open and left it framed by the entrance, with the moon shining behind it. The men behind the bar gave a friendly sigh and a quiet muttering sound swept through the room. As she made her way toward the bar, the men at the tables moved toward her, and some left as she disappeared through the doorway. Ignoring her, all eyes in the room were fixed on her. Outside, the wind howled as someone tried to close the door. Jimmy looked at her. He didn't look away or try to hide. He just looked straight at her. She looked really good, he thought. Her long hair was brown and parted to the sides of her head, as if she had just been caught in the rain. But it was a clear evening. She was probably washing a boat or a car or something. She was thin to the extreme. But there was something crazy in her eyes, he thought. He had never met a very thin woman before. The skinny woman walked over to where Jimmy was standing. She tilted her head to the side and looked at him strangely. Then she smiled at him. Her clothes looked like they had seen better days. She seemed very old-fashioned. Even the way her long hair was styled seemed to date back at least 20, 30 years, if not more. She was either very poor or a prostitute, or both. Now Jimmy had a game he could play. He had a new game. He smiled broadly back at her. He noticed that some of the men around him crossed themselves. It never ceased to amaze him how superstitious most sailors were. This omen probably had something to do with the women in the sailors' bar. There was another omen related to women aboard ship, but he'd entertained Melissa several times before on the Maitland and nothing bad had happened. To hell with superstition. Now, he noticed that what he mistook for some kind of necklace was actually several strands of underwater plants growing in the lakes that wrapped around her neck. It was a little strange. She must have been one of those greenies with their delusions of saving the planet. He reached out and took her hand and pulled her toward the table. He flinched slightly when she followed him. Her hand was cold as ice, and she smelled strange. She smelled like something damn familiar, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. "So what brings you here, babe?" he asked. "You," she replied. Jimmy smiled even wider. It's like fishing in a bucket, he thought. Not 10 minutes later, she took his hand and led him outside. She didn't name a price, but they both knew what they were going outside for. Even as they tried to slam the door shut against the wind, Jimmy thought he heard someone say something about a witch. He laughed again at their silly superstitions. "Where are we going, baby?" he asked. She squeezed his hand as if in a vice. It even hurt a little. The river had been calm until a few minutes ago, but now the water in it felt like it was rolling over, like a storm was coming. The funny thing was that, as he looked down the river in both directions, the water seemed to calm down more and more the farther he traveled away. It seemed as if a storm or mini-storm was following him. He had heard of strange localized weather events and pocket storms before, but he never expected to see something like this. She pointed to a small boat bobbing on the choppy water. It was barely tethered to a small pier used by local fishermen who didn't have a boat. "There's no way I'm getting in this tiny boat in such rough water," he said. "Are you afraid?" she asked, smiling at him. "No, I just have a good head on my shoulders," he snapped back. She smiled at him again, as if she liked the image. While she was smiling, the weather calmed down almost instantly. The river barely moved and the wind became much slower and weaker, almost a warm breeze. "It was just a splash," she said. "We have them from time to time in the fall. But being a professional sailor, I know you've heard of them, right?" "Of course I've heard of them," Jimmy lied. "I guess if you're afraid to do it in a boat, we'll have to pass," she said. "Let's run to the boat," he shouted. As Jimmy looked at the boat, a shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't exactly fear, but it wasn't too far from it either. It was just a feeling of unease, as if something was telling him he shouldn't do this. It disappeared when he saw the woman stretched out on the bow of the tiny boat. The funny thing was, Jimmy didn't see her climb into the boat. He walked a little behind her, and then she just appeared in the boat. It was as if the wind had just carried her to the boat. No, that was impossible. If he kept this up, he was going to be as bad as those old men with all their legends of the lakes. Jimmy stepped down into the boat from the small dock and peered into the face of his future lover. Jimmy moved into the boat to be closer to her. He noticed that she was smiling, even smiling a little too much. "Jimmy," she said, "I like you." That was odd. He didn't remember telling her his name, but he must have said it. "I actually wanted you before I even saw you," she said. Jimmy laughed a big laugh. He usually said trite phrases to women himself. Another peculiarity was that her voice had changed. "How could you want me before you even saw me?" he asked. That feeling he had dismissed as a silly superstitious premonition came back with renewed vigor. His own voice, too, sounded different from usual. Perhaps there was some strange atmospheric phenomena going on here that was changing the voices of both of them. Jimmy looked around and noticed that the little boat was far away on the bank of the busy river. If this had happened during daylight hours, they would have had no trouble calling for help, but at night, at this time of year, they might well have frozen to death. Hearing her voice distracted him from thinking on the subject. Besides, Jimmy was suddenly colder. The wind had turned into a steady breeze, and the waves were bigger again. The wind seemed to ripple the water. "It was your words," the woman told him. "It was your words that woke me up." Today was only the 30th day of October. I should not have interrupted my sleep for nearly 2 of your 7-day periods. What do you call them? Weeks, that's all. I should have slept for 2 more weeks. Now, I'm going to have to pay for it. It's like those legends you're sucking up, Jimmy. That goddamn song. Oh, I hate that damn song. It reminds me of how I came to be the way you see me now. Jimmy started to move away from her as she spoke. He noticed that the light he saw in her eyes was not a reflection of moonlight. The glow was coming from inside her eyes. There was some weird shit going on. One could only hope she would talk until someone spotted the small boat. At night, the place was full of river patrols and Coast Guard ships. All he needed was time. He was a strong swimmer, and as soon as he saw the boat, he could swim over the side. "What's that song?" Jimmy asked loudly. He himself was surprised at how strong his voice was. Even though he was ready to shit his pants with fear, he looked her in the eye and spoke to her. "What legend are you babbling about?" he asked. "I hate all those old legends and stuff." "Oh, I can't remember the names of the songs," she said. Her voice became even more like the sound of the wind. "My sisters and I have been around for over 10,000 years. Many songs have been written about lakes and storms. But this song really tells the whole story. It made me accept this body only 30 or so of your years ago." Maybe it was the wind's deception, but Jimmy thought he heard a slow and wistful melody coming from somewhere. It also seemed to him that a man was singing. He could hardly make out the words. It was one of those old sad songs you heard on the old radio stations and listened to until they depressed you and ruined your whole day. They say the lake never gives up its dead when the November storms come early. Jimmy was sure he'd heard that song. He had never paid attention to it or even knew who sang that song. But right now, it seemed like the most important song in his whole damn life. He quickly tried to change the subject. "But it wasn't the song that made you want me, was it?" he asked. Jimmy knew the negotiation had changed. He felt it was about survival. The waves on the river were so big that there were only a few boats left on it. He couldn't understand it, for only a few minutes ago the river had been calm. "No, Jimmy," she whispered and smiled at him. "It was your wonderful romantic words that woke me up and made me look for you." "What did I say?" Jimmy asked. "Whatever it was, I'm sorry. I take it back. I didn't mean to do that. I didn't mean to do anything like that. Oh, please, Jesus, Jesus, help me." The woman in the front of the boat only laughed. "God's on a break, Jimmy. It's just us here now." The wind brought more and more strange sounds to Jimmy's ears. The same sad song was still playing as if it was especially for him. Does anyone know where God's love goes when the waves turn minutes into hours? "Please give me a chance," Jimmy shouted. His words were lost, muffled by the wind, but he knew she could hear him. "What did I do? What did I say to wake you up?" "Oh, you remember, Jimmy," she said as the wind picked up even more. "You remember calling out to me. You said it over and over again. To hell with the witch." Jimmy realized his life was over. The woman's face took on a completely different expression. There was something very ancient about it, predating all other religions in the area. She was part of the wind. In fact, she was the wind. The woman in the boat was a November witch. Jimmy felt himself being lifted high above the boat. He was hanging in the air under the pressure of the wind. The wind stirred up the water and even the sand on the riverbank. The sand was moving so fast it was ripping the skin off Jimmy's flesh. He screamed as welts and cuts appeared on every exposed part of his body. "Why are you screaming, Jimmy?" she asked. Her exclamation scared him more than what he realized now. "Because it hurts like hell," he replied. "You try having your body sandblasted by a crazy bitch. I'd rather drown." Even after saying that, Jimmy realized he'd made a mistake. Suddenly, the wind died down and Jimmy plunged into the icy water. The water immediately made his cuts ache, but it was only a momentary sensation. The water was so cold that he immediately began to freeze. Jimmy tried to swim out but couldn't. Then he felt something grab his ankle under the water. He opened his eyes and tried to look around to see what he was caught on. He gasped in surprise, and the life-saving breath he had been holding back escaped his lungs all at once. Jimmy was surprised when he realized he hadn't hooked his ankle on anything. The witch had grabbed his ankle and was pulling him to the bottom of the river. As Jimmy began to lose consciousness, he could barely make out the facial features of the woman holding him underwater. She sat calmly in front of him on a rock at the bottom of the river and watched the life leave his freezing body. She watched his death the way one watches a sitcom on television. Each new episode may be different, but when all is said and done, you've seen it all before. Jimmy felt his soul being ripped from his body. He wasn't just dying, he was being remade. Memories left him even as his body surrendered to the icy cold and lack of oxygen. When his lungs burned, he forgot his childhood. When the icy water filled his pores, he forgot his name and his teenage years. It was the worst death imaginable. Jimmy could accept death, but wasn't this where he was supposed to see his life flash before his eyes? Wasn't this where he was supposed to experience his greatest victories and defeats? He had gotten none of that. He struggled to remember his name as his soul was sucked into the witch. Suddenly, she twitched. She looked around and hissed angrily. The movement was too fast for him to notice, and she headed for the surface and rose above it. Jimmy paid no attention to her reaction to what was bothering her. Next chapter. A large man stood on the riverbank and shouted. He was dressed head to toe in black leather. His eyes glittered in the moonlight even as he looked at the rushing waters. Gashkadino hisis, he shouted again. Come out and speak to me before I cast you out. Suddenly, Noyabrina sprang out of the water and hovered in the air, supported by the wind. Seeing the man, she laughed. What do you want, little one? She asked, laughing. I'm very busy. Go back to your house, the man shouted. This is not one of your lakes. Let the one you are tormenting leave and go back to your place before I drive you away. November laughed and whirled in the air. You can't chase me away, little shaman. And if you keep getting on my nerves, I will kill you. Your powers are not as great as those of your ancestors. You've been weakened by contact with the Europeans and their descendants. It takes more than knowing my name to banish me. Knowing my name only draws attention to yourself, and my attention can be deadly. As soon as she said this, Jimmy's body floated to the surface. The man in black leather noticed the body and looked back at the witch. Lucky for you, that's not who I woke up for. He was just an appetizer. If you keep pestering me, I will end you, shaman. Or should I say the rest of the shamans? Where's your proud war pony? All I see is a wagon with a small horse in front. You have no power over me. The big man tried to say something, but the wind roared so loudly that he couldn't find the words. The wind was blowing so hard he could barely stand on his feet. All he could do was watch the witch fly away from him, carried by the wind. When she was gone, he ran up to the riverbank. The body was close enough that he could grab it and pull it to shore. He pulled the body to shore and began CPR. He screamed, but there was no one to scream. That's when he pulled out his iPhone and called emergency services. He continued CPR until the paramedics arrived. Along with them, the police also arrived. He explained how he pulled the body out of the water and they handled the rest on their own. In talking to police, he said he went out for a ride and parked a few yards away to watch the boats going by on the river. As he got closer to the water, he saw the body and pulled it out. None of the policemen and paramedics had ever seen marks like those on the body. Besides being almost drowned, the body had large wounds on it that looked like cut marks. They wrote down his name and number and said they might have questions for him later. The medics weren't sure if the man would even survive. Apparently, he had spent too much time without oxygen when he was rescued. Even if he survived, he would likely have brain damage. John Lake shook his head. There was too much going on here. His great-grandfather had been a powerful shaman. His grandfather had been a powerful drunk. And his father, who knows? He ran away shortly after John's mother gave birth to him. John's knowledge of the old customs and rituals was sketchy at best. He wasn't a shaman. Hell, he was actually an engineer. He worked in quality control at the Ford plant in Hamtramck. He was out of his league. He took off his leather jacket and went to his car. A pony car, as she called it. His Mustang GT produced over 450 horsepower, and the symbol on the front dash was his totem of power. He'd be happy if any of his half-naked ancestors kept up with his speed. Next chapter. Ramona was waiting for Jimmy on the dock of the Maitland. It had been over 3 hours since he had asked, and she was beginning to worry. Cliff must have gotten home by now and noticed her absence. It would be quite some time before he discovered what she had taken. Luckily, she had so many clothes that the few outfits she had taken with her wouldn't leave a trace in her closet. If she was lucky, he might even think she'd gotten mad and gone to her friend's house until she was ready to talk to him. If she thought that, she could call him and tell him about it. That would have given her a few days to hide. But she'd thrown away the cell phone he'd bought her, so she couldn't be tracked on it. She'd bought a disposable cell phone, but she didn't think calling him on it would be a good idea. Giving him the opportunity to track her wasn't in her best interest. With Cliff's money, if she didn't keep a low profile, he'd easily find her. Ramona shuddered. Damn, it was cold out here by the water. She needed to think about what she would do if Jimmy tricked her. She was sure he'd agree to anything she wanted. Most guys did whatever she wanted without question. Maybe she was getting old and losing her appeal. A little voice in the back of her mind said, "That's another reason why you should have stayed with Cliff. He loved you, silly. You could have been happy and had everything." She pushed those thoughts away when she saw the light of a lighter on the deck of the big ship. "Hey, sailor," she called out. When he looked in her direction, Ramona saw that he was the same guy who had told Jimmy she was waiting for him. He looked at her and waved, then took a drag on his cigarette and headed for the gangway. He walked down the aluminum structure and in a few moments was standing next to her. "Damn, it's cold," he began and immediately stammered. "Why are you just standing there?" Ramona smiled at him and Carl felt the blood rush to his head. "Oh, you're waiting for Jimmy again," he said. "He should be back any moment. We're out at first light. But you fellows will have plenty of time to, you know." He looked at Ramona again. She was definitely beautiful. "Hey, I probably shouldn't do this, but do you want to wait for him on Jimmy's bunk? The captain isn't back yet either. He probably won't show up until just before we sail. His family lives here in town, and he likes to sleep in his own bed. As big as this ship is, the crew is only 29 men, so no one will be able to find you in Jimmy's bunk." "Oh, thank you very much," Ramona said. "I'll tell Jimmy how kind you've been to me. Maybe we can find a way to thank you later." Carl liked that idea. He wondered if she was thinking about thanking him as much as he was. If so, he looked forward to that moment. What was odd was that she was carrying several bags with her. He wondered why she didn't just leave them in the car. He walked her back to Jimmy's bunk again and went to play cards with the guys on his watch. Next chapter. Cliff Darden was driving fast, perhaps even too fast. The events of the last few hours had thrown him out of sorts. He was letting his heart drive his actions, not his head. The meeting with the private investigator had gone as Cliff had expected, badly. And then it got even worse. Cliff went to the private investigator's office and got the expected paperwork. He had pictures and videos of Ramona in action. The private investigator warned him not to look at them. He told Cliff that it would be best to just present them to her as proof that he knew what she was doing. Then he could use them as leverage to get her to stop. The old private investigator had warned him that if he looked at the photos or videos, it would be even harder to repair the marriage. "Believe me, son, I've been in this business a long time. I've seen relationships that were far worse than yours not only recover and survive, but grow stronger after something like this. Things may look bad now, but if you're willing to put in the effort, you'll make it work." Cliff didn't even bother to tell the old man that he believed him. No matter what Ramona had done, he was willing to give her a second chance, but only one. That's why he needed the photos, videos, and dossier. He was going to meet with her when he got home, give her the dossier, and then lay out his terms for them to stay together. She knew that the prenup they had made would get her virtually nothing if they divorced in less than 7 years, and it had only been 2. The thing was, even if Ramona cheated on him, having her in his life was far better than the alternative. He really didn't have a choice. He loved her so much that the thought of life without her was agonizing. If that deemed him a weakling, then so be it. Cliff headed home, pondering if there was really a reason she was cheating on him. Maybe it was gambling. Ramona clearly had no idea how much money they actually had. Oh, please, let it be gambling. He could pay off her debts, send her to counseling, and they'd be back to their happy life before. Ramona, he called out as he entered the house. He placed the folder on the kitchen table. He had rehearsed what he was going to say to her in the car on the way home. He was going to ask her to look at the pictures and maybe the video in the folder. He was going to tell her that he had seen them before, and he didn't have the heart to look at them again. If he saw them again, he wouldn't be able to avoid kicking her out of the house. It was better this way. The only thing wrong with his plan was that Ramona wasn't home. He'd called her several times, walked around the house, but she wasn't there. He sat down at the kitchen table, put the file folders in front of him, and practiced taking on an angry look. Half an hour later, he looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. Ramona had never been gone this long. He tried to call her, but her phone immediately went straight to voicemail. In their entire marriage, Ramona had never stayed home longer than 9 or 10 hours unless they were together. Something was wrong, and he knew it. He tried calling a few of her friends, but none of them knew anything about her whereabouts. Cliff didn't know what to do. He sat down to watch TV and fell asleep in front of it. A few hours later, he woke up and went up to their bedroom. She still hadn't come back, and it was almost 3 in the morning. And then he noticed it. The painting that hid their wall safe was slightly ajar. He walked over to the painting and noticed that the safe was not locked. Moreover, the safe was empty. His first thought was that the house had been broken into or robbed. Perhaps they had taken Ramona hostage. He went downstairs to his office, opened a program on his computer that allowed him to view the security footage from the security cameras in their house. They usually use the tapes not only to determine if someone had broken into their house, but also to find out if contractors, laborers, or anyone else who worked for them were stealing from them. To save hard drive space, the cameras were motion-activated and only saved video for 2 weeks. Scrolling through the screen, he recalled the last movements in the house before he went home. The last image he saw was Ramona leaving the house. She was alone and walking quickly forward. Scrolling the screen further, he saw Ramona emptying the safe and taking a couple bags full of her own clothes and personal belongings. Tears rolled down Cliff's cheeks. Why had she abandoned him? Didn't she know he loved her? If she wanted the money and other junk she'd taken, let her take it. She didn't have to leave. Maybe she thought she had no choice. Maybe she knew he knew she was cheating on him. Maybe she thought he intended to leave her with nothing. That was the way it had to be. Cliff needed to find her, but how? And then he remembered the locator chip in her car. That was ridiculous. How they'd argued over that damn car. She wanted the Lexus her friends drove. Cliff refused and bought her a Cadillac XRS convertible instead. Cliff insisted on buying American-made cars. Ramona stomped her feet and refused to get behind the wheel. For 3 weeks, the beautiful car just sat in their driveway. Eventually, one of Ramona's friends' Lexus broke down and they had to drive the Cadillac or miss an appointment with the hairdresser. She loved that car and all her friends envied her. It took a few months, but by the end of that year, all of Ramona's closest friends were driving Cadillacs. Cliff called the service department of a company that made chips for locators. He told the woman on the phone that his wife had gone shopping and literally lost the car. Ramona had left the keys in the car and called the company to unlock it so many times that losing the car or forgetting where she parked it wasn't a big deal. The woman gave Cliff the location and he got into his Mustang, heading toward the riverfront. Pulling into the nearest parking lot, Cliff saw Ramona's bright red Caddy. He ran up to the car and realized it was over. The car doors were open. The keys were on the seat along with an envelope. He opened the envelope and read the note. Cliff, don't miss me or get upset. I wish I could honestly tell you that I'm sorry or say a few kind words to make you feel better. But the truth is, in the long run, that would only give you false hope and end up making things harder. It's not about you finding out that I cheated on you. So don't think that's the point. Don't torture yourself trying to figure out what you did wrong and why I stopped loving you. You have to realize that our entire relationship was a lie. I never stopped loving you because I never started. From the first time we met, you were just a way for me to hide from the police and everyone else who was looking for me. When we got together, I planned on being married to you long enough for the fervor to subside. I thought 6 months to a year at the most. If it's any consolation, you were so loving and such a damn puppy dog that after the first year, I decided to stay longer so I could suck up more of your money and take it with me. Unfortunately, you figured me out before I could. And don't worry about cheating, dear. We were never compatible in bed. You're just too much in love with me. Not every woman wants a man to make slow, gentle love to her. Some of us like it rough. It's just not your style. I'm sure one day you'll find yourself some boring little woman and make her damn happy and even have a house full of kids, but I'm just not like that. If there's one thing I regret, it's that I didn't know your poor little heart would be broken. Trust me, Cliff, you needed someone to screw you over. You're too trusting and too damn cute to survive without learning a few painful lessons about the real world. My only regret is that I couldn't take more of your damn money with me. The letter was signed Ramona. She later added P.S. Ramona isn't even my real name. And while I won't miss you, I will miss this car. Cliff just collapsed and sat next to the car, crying his eyes out. He didn't know how long he sat like that. It could have been minutes or hours. But then, it all went downhill from there. The first sign that something was wrong was the increase in wind. Cliff didn't care. He didn't know what to do or where to go. He never thought his life with Ramona would end. He was ready to forgive her no matter what. The stupid thing was that even after reading the letter, he was still ready. Then the streetlights on the street began to flicker on and off. The wind was blowing with such force that signs were bending before their eyes, and anything that wasn't nailed down was flying down the street. Cliff looked around and saw her. It was a strange-looking woman, and she was staring at him intently. She was saying something to him, but he couldn't hear her words over the wind. As if sensing his thoughts, she shook her head from side to side and the wind died down. This has to be a coincidence, Cliff thought. You're a man, the woman hissed. Cliff only nodded his head. Hardly, he said quietly. I don't understand, the woman said. I've never dealt with men. I have to make life better for those whose hearts have been ripped out by adultery. Oh, sometimes I do someone who's just an outright asshole for sport. But I don't get it. You have to be a woman to feel that much pain. Men don't feel that much emotional pain unless their dog dies, their team loses a championship, or someone scratches their damn car. Every once in a while you meet one who gets upset about the kids, but I've never seen one. She looked at him curiously. Tell me something. Tell me your story, she said. Cliff was too stunned to say or do anything. The woman made a gesture and the hurricane wind became even stronger, but only around him. The wind lifted Cliff, screaming and kicking, into the air and carried him over the river. Before he could catch his breath, he plunged into the icy water. As he plunged into the water, Cliff realized that he just didn't care. Without Ramona in his life, there was no point in moving on. He felt someone grab him underwater and he didn't even bother to fight back. Noabrina grabbed Cliff and placed her icy hands on his head. She needed his memories, and she erased them as she took them away. She erased every memory of Ramon. What a bitch. When Cliff wakes up, he won't remember anything about Ramona at all. Noabrina felt someone's presence above her. There was a police car patrolling the street just behind the bank. It ran down a sign right in front of the car, forcing it to pull onto the beach to go around the sign. The policewoman driving the car got out and saw Cliff kicking and struggling to keep from drowning in the icy water. Noabrina smiled as she watched the woman wade into the water and pull the man out. He would be better now, but she had things to do. No sooner had she started searching for her target than Noabrina was suddenly pulled further down the river. As she rose above the water, she noticed that the pull was stronger this time. It was him, the same insect that had disturbed her earlier. Clad in black leather, John Lake once again held the ancient cudgel of Ojibwa power. This time he called two of her names, so the call was stronger. He still couldn't control her, but he was getting smarter. He didn't realize that she had two spirits now. One was the wind of the Great Lakes and the other was human. The great tragedy and abuse of power that had caused an incredible amount of grief had caused her spirit to merge with the former master of this body. Now Noabrina had to correct mistakes like the ones her body had made every year. The last thing this little shamaness had tried to save was just a tidbit. She had swatted Jimmy for a reason, but for insulting and calling her names. Now the little shamaness was threatening Noabrina's business. If he ever found out the third name, he might not be able to banish her for good, but he could send her to bed until next year. Noabrina had no idea what might happen in that case. It will be his own fault, she warned him. The Witch of November, John Lake said, holding his wand in front of him. Known in the language of my people as Gashkadino Hysis, I banish you to your sister's lakes forever. From now and forever, you can only exist in Erie, Ontario, Michigan, Huron, and Superior. Embark on your journey and never leave these waters again. Feel my power. John gestured with his war club. He felt a ripple of immense power emanating from his ancestral mace. Nubrina felt a slight tingling sensation. It angered her. She made a gesture, and John Lake rose into the air not far from where she hovered. Feel the wall, she hissed. Hurricane-force winds carried John Lake backward at nearly 90 miles per hour. Noya Brina saved John's life at the last moment, twisting him in the air to keep him from hitting his head on the wall. In doing so, he broke 7 ribs, both legs, and his left arm. As he fell unconsciously to the ground, Noya Brina carefully lowered herself to the grass beside him. She didn't know why she had spared him. There was something about it. She made another gesture, and he was awakened by a light, cool breeze. He looked up at her in horror. "Sister, I let you keep your right hand so you could write me a thank you note," she smirked. "Next time you try to control me, you'll die." "But I'm left-handed," John growled. "Sue me," Nubrina said and walked toward the river. Her thoughts were already occupied with finding someone. Next chapter. Should I stay or should I go? Janet Charles thought as she looked at the sleeping man in the hospital bed next to her. She sat in the chair next to his bed, watching for signs that he might be awake. He was handsome, but didn't seem to realize what was going on. Only 2 hours ago, she had pulled him out of the river. He was shivering from the cold and didn't realize how he ended up in the water. He kept saying he was on his way to find... And then everything disappeared. He couldn't remember what he was looking for. The detective assigned to the case kept her informed of all developments. Detective Bernie Gorka was new to her precinct, but not to the police force. He was a good cop and provided her with all sorts of information about the man she had fished out of the river. Janet absorbed it all. Even though she wasn't involved in the investigation, the captain didn't seem to mind her spending time in the hospital until the case was over. There were too many funny parts of the case. And Janet's problem was that the more information she got about the alleged victim, the more she wanted to know. She spent hours just staring at him and wondering while he slept. Gorka's report filled in most of the blanks, but 1 or 2 questions still remained. His name was Clifford Darden. Apparently he was married, but when they'd checked him and his wife as part of their operational work, a few interesting facts had come to light. He didn't say anything interesting about himself. He was some kind of software engineer. Supposedly, he was very good at what he did and was charged with proving it. He wasn't like Bill Gates, but dropping $1 million or $2 wouldn't send him to an almshouse. He had no criminal record, and barring the occasional speeding ticket, he'd never been in trouble with the law. Even those speeding tickets he paid promptly and was very polite to the officers writing the tickets. Janet had seen his car at the scene of the accident. Cars like this one probably came with a commitment to get a fine or 3. The contract you signed when you bought it probably said you wouldn't hold Ford Motor Company liable for any fines you received while driving it. Anyway, when they checked on the wife, alarm bells were ringing all over the place. The first thing that raised suspicion was that they had gotten married in Las Vegas. Anyone can get married there, so why a rich guy would have a Vegas wedding was suspicious. Then they found out that Ramona Cruz doesn't exist. The only Ramona Cruz they found had died in 1980. The age was appropriate, but nothing more. Apparently, she had taken someone else's name. Checking the couple's financial records, they found something interesting. The wife had recently withdrawn all the dollars from the couple's bank accounts. In fact, she did it yesterday. When they checked the bank records, they got lucky. The bank used a fingerprint system to access the vaults. They ran the prints and got a match. Ramona Cruz was an alias. The woman was actually Margaret Ann McGillicuddy. She had multiple warrants out for her arrest over a decade. She disappeared almost 2 years ago after a major insurance scam in Chicago. Everyone involved was caught and served time, but Margaret was never caught. Now we know why. She was hiding in plain sight as the wife of a good citizen. When they dumped his cell phone, they found out he was in the area looking for his wife's car. They searched her car as well, and one of the fingerprints lifted from the car unmistakably confirmed that Margaret Ann McGillicuddy was Ramona Cruz, aka Ramona Darden. Even worse was the note she'd left for the poor bastard. When Janet read the note, her heart dropped too. What kind of bitch would leave such a note to someone who loved her as much as this guy did? Even the rugged, battle-hardened men working the case sympathized with the guy. Most of them couldn't look at him. It was like having to interview someone with a terrible disease. It wasn't the disease or even the fact of having it that was scary. It was the possibility that you could be in their shoes. Cops had a history of failed relationships and broken marriages. Any one of these guys could be in Darden's shoes. Janet was no stranger to failed relationships herself. Her last boyfriend had been a little rougher than the others. The fact that she was a cop clearly threatened his macho ego, so there had been a few fights and scuffles. The last one came down to a brawl. She had to put a gun to his face to get him to back off. That was almost a year ago. He never decided to come back for his stuff. 6 months later, she donated all of his clothes and personal belongings to the Salvation Army. She hadn't had a single date since, and she hadn't practiced celibacy. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she couldn't understand why in her 32 years she was still single. She was attractive. All of her friends were either already married or divorced and working on second marriages. Some of them already had children. Janet wasn't even particularly picky about choosing men. She just needed a man who would love her and treat her well. She didn't need Brad Pitt. She just needed a regular, everyday guy who wanted to be hers. "Where am I?" the man lying on the bed next to her asked. His voice brought Janet out of her reverie. "Mr. Darden, you're in the hospital," she replied. "Do you remember how you got here?" "Yes," he said. "I was in the river and a very beautiful policewoman pulled me out." Janet's face took on the brightest possible shade of red. "It was you, wasn't it?" he asked. She nodded her head and tried hard not to smile. "What else do you remember?" he asked. "Do you remember how you ended up in the water or why? And why you ended up on the riverbank in the first place?" "There was a wind of almost hurricane force," he said. "I think I lost my balance and was blown into the river. But I have no idea why I ended up there. Wait, I was looking for something or someone, but I don't remember what. We think you were looking for your wife. Apparently she ran away from you and took a lot of money with her. We read the note she left you. I hope you won't take offense if I tell you, but she was a bitch. You deserve much better than she did," Janet said. Cliff Darden looked at her curiously. "Officer, I'm not married. I don't have a wife," he said. "Maybe you're working on too many cases and are confusing me with someone else?" Later that day, Darden was examined by both doctors and psychologists. It was determined that he was suffering from a very mild hypothermia. This was probably due to exposure to the extreme cold caused by immersion in the river. Otherwise, there was nothing wrong with him mentally or physically. The problem was that he just couldn't remember anything about his wife and the life they led, even though he was actually married. The ceremony and marriage could easily be undone by simply going to a judge in any state and asking for an annulment. The marriage was a sham from the beginning. His wife lied about everything on the marriage certificate. In addition, she married him under false pretenses. When she showed him copies of the documents, he could hardly bring himself to remember it. Janet began to be constantly at his bedside. Since Janet liked being with him and Cliff had no relatives in the area, she began doing things for him, such as contacting his lawyers. The psychologist also decided that she should be the one to break the news to him about his wife and help him figure out what to do about her and his legal status. He had considered moving to a private room, but found no reason to do so. The big guy in the next bed was in a medically induced coma. He had been found in the same neighborhood as Cliff almost at the same time. He was a large Native American man who had almost all of his bones broken. They were going to try to revive him the next day if he didn't come out of the coma on his own. Next chapter. Ramona woke up and looked out the window of the small room on the ship. There was the sound of footsteps, then the door opened. "Jimmy," she called out cautiously. "No, it's Carl," he replied. "We need to talk. It's 5 in the morning and I have news for you. We have to get you off this ship. The captain is back, and we'll be on our way in less than half an hour." "Where's Jimmy?" she asked. "Jimmy's dead," he said. "The police arrived about 2 hours ago. I knew you had nothing to do with it since you were sleeping here at the time it happened. They didn't ask any questions about you, so I didn't bother telling them anything either. We have to get you out of here." "But I can't," she began. She gently took Carl's hand. "They're not looking for me because of Jimmy, but there are people looking for me." Jimmy was going to let me go to Wisconsin with the ship so I could start a new life. My husband is rich, and he has a lot of people looking for me. If they find me and bring me back to him, it will be terrible. The last time I tried to run away from him, I couldn't leave the house for almost a month. Please just hide me. Carl listened to Ramona's story. He also looked at her. Carl was older and smarter than Jimmy. He did not feel the slightest sympathy for Ramona. Moreover, looking at her, he could tell she was lying through her teeth. Next chapter. John Lake woke up in the hospital. Most of his body was bandaged or covered in band-aids. Everything he could think of hurt. It felt like he had been run over by a truck. He realized that he should be grateful to be alive at all. The day before, he had talked to his great-grandfather. The old man had given him a powerful totem. The battle club supposedly had immense power, and he used both names for the autumn storm's elemental. He used both the Ojibwa version of her name and the name the sailors from the Great Lakes called her. It should have worked, but it didn't. The day passed, and Halloween came. Tonight, the veil between all dimensions would be thinner than ever, and all spirits, especially spirits as ancient and powerful as the wind elemental, would be at the limit of their powers. He had missed his chance. His best chance to stop Neuburn from doing what she wanted was gone. He could feel it in his skin that the man she had killed the first time they met was, in her mind, just an appetizer. She wanted to kill someone else, and there was nothing he could do about it. Now he realized he wasn't much of a shaman. Yes, he drove his Mustang around in black leather, but when it came to business, November chewed him up and spit him out. She did what her sister Gitchigumi did with ships, like the shipwreck song. This good and faithful ship began to gnaw on the bone when the November storms came early. Only luck and caprice saved him. In the Detroit River, he met a witch. Her power, though immense, was not as great as on one of the Great Lakes. She would be especially strong on Lake Superior. This was another line from the song, and also one of his people's legends of the Great Lakes. The legend of the Great Lake they call Gitchigumi lives among the Chippewa and below. Superior, they say, never gives up its dead when the November storms come early. Both the song and the legend of his people say almost the same thing. If November pursued someone or something and caught up with them on Lake Superior, it meant death. It was quite possible that there would be a great many of them. John knew that the only reason he was still alive was because of the witch's capricious nature. The first time they had met, she had simply smiled and left him a warning. This time, she might have killed him. She even joked that she would leave him with one arm. John decided to just pray for the spirits of all the people in the lakes, because there was nothing he could do to save them. However, something didn't add up here. The November Witch was the name given to the early fall storms in the Great Lakes. When and how had she acquired her body? Why did she need it? John's musings were interrupted by the pounding of heels on the hospital floor. A woman walked past his bed and approached the man lying next to him. She was beautiful. He'd been lucky. John had had several relationships, but never a woman who loved him as much as this one obviously loved the guy in the next bed. He tried to go back to sleep and ended up overhearing their conversation. He knew he shouldn't do it, but hell, he didn't have a TV or radio. They were talking about some woman who had done a man wrong. He was supposedly totally in love with her, and she ripped his heart out. The man kept saying he just didn't remember her. When the woman or the doctor with her showed him the picture, there was no reaction on his face. He just didn't remember her. Even under hypnosis, he could not remember anything about her or that he had ever seen her. Under hypnosis, however, he described another woman. He described her as thin, with disheveled, downward flowing hair. He also claimed that she was floating on the wind and blew him into the river. When the psychologist left, John saw a woman, who must have been a police officer, cover the man with a blanket to put him to sleep. She shook her head sadly and whispered, "If only." Straightening up, she met John's gaze and realized that he had been awake and watching her for some time. Before she could think of what to say in her near-panic state, John reassured her. "Don't worry," he said. "I've been there. I won't say a word." The woman nodded her thanks and left the room. John noticed that she had come to see the man again, though she was off duty and out of uniform. Next chapter. Ramona rested her head back on the dirty mattress on Jimmy's small bed. At the rate this ship was moving, she'd probably be dead before they reached Wisconsin. It was Halloween night and the crew was celebrating. For the captain and officers, that meant drinking a glass of rum each and telling some spooky stories about the strange things that happened on the lakes. It was several hours before Ramona learned the truth. Carl had been charging his companions money to entertain her. He was also profiting from her. At $50 apiece, Carl had already made over $1,000 on her. At this rate, he would be much richer by the time they reached Wisconsin. "Do you know what diseases I'm at risk of contracting?" he asked. It's just not worth the risk. Who needs it? Once again, the thought that had been niggling at her since she'd left the house yesterday came back to her. I should have stayed with Cliff. That man loved me. We could have made it work. She buried that thought. Her whole life had been like that. Now it was too late to change anything. Next chapter. At midnight, November appeared over the waters of Lake Superior. She mentally reached out to him, and the wind touched every boat on the lake. The one she sought would soon be here. She felt the big boat carry on the water at nearly 15 knots. She was just passing Black Bay on the American side of the lake. She had not yet entered the lake itself, but she could already feel the evil and pain that her target was causing. Just thinking about it, she felt the wind on the lake become stronger and colder. Due to the increased wind on the lake, the size of the waves increased. Noyabrina smiled. From the way the wind was caressing the large cargo ship, she could sense that there were people living on board. Whether the ship would survive the night and if any of its crew would die was out of her hands. This time, the decision would be up to them. Aboard the Maitland, a radio and communications officer contacted the National Weather Service. His name was Paul Pittman, and he was alarmed. The waves had risen a little. It was a little noisier than he expected, but he had a bad feeling about it. The Weather Service report said warming and smaller waves. He radioed his friend on the ship, who was elsewhere on the upper. The lake was huge, so big that there were times when it didn't rain all over the lake, but only in one part of it. After talking to his friend, his misgivings were heightened. The temperature and wave heights of the other vessel were exactly as predicted for that night. Of course, he couldn't say anything to the captain or the other officers. They would have laughed at him, and he would have been the object of all sorts of jokes for years to come. An hour later, Pittman called the captain. He need not have worried. The temperature had dropped so low and the wind had picked up so strong that the ship was moving through the water at half the speed its engines were giving out. Worse, the size of the waves had nearly doubled since they had entered the high point. The ship couldn't handle them, but it was still scary to swim. Pittman looked up when one of the senior deck sailors asked permission to come up to the bridge. It was Isaac Turner. He had been serving on the Maitland for over a decade. His face was green. "We'll be all right, Ike," said Captain Gordon Song. He was a Canadian who had worked on the Great Lakes for nearly 40 years. "I've seen hundreds of storms like this, and so has the Maitland. I know what you're thinking, but it's just a blip. Go back to your berth. Have a drink, and it'll all be over before you know it." Ike saluted and nodded his head. He knew the captain was lying, but he was a good sailor and always followed orders or pretended to. He also realized that the captain wasn't lying because he was dishonest. He was lying because he needed to make it appear that the crew's confidence that the ship and its captain would survive was as high as possible. If the captain looked scared, what would happen to the rest of the crew? It was a necessary lie. What in medicine is called a benevolent deception? If a doctor tells you that a shot is going to hurt like hell, most people will never, ever let anyone give it. Likewise, if the captain tells the crew he's afraid or starts ranting about old superstitions, who knows what might happen? But Isaac had never seen waves like this in all his years on the lakes, and on this ship in particular. It was like riding a goddamn roller coaster. And after all, a ship this big was supposed to be breaking waves, not climbing up and rolling down them. Everywhere he looked, everyone, like the captain, knew it was the November witch coming for a steal. Ike saw the men who usually stood on deck at night and watched the water, even in the stormiest weather, squirming in their cabins with frightened expressions on their faces. Ike knew that by morning this crew would either be telling this story to their grandchildren or be part of the story someone else would be telling theirs. As Ike carefully made his way out of the bridge, a strong gust of wind slammed him against the bulkhead. For a split second he held on, but then he was swept off his feet. Suddenly, an even stronger gust of wind picked up the large man and held him in the air. He carefully lowered himself to his feet and looked around. This was damn strange, he thought. Jimmy would be glad to know that. Of course, he would never believe it. Jimmy didn't believe anything, Isaac. It was his damn problem, came a voice from behind Ike. He turned around and looked. There, at the railing where he and Jimmy had watched the kids waving at them in Detroit, stood a slender woman. "Come and talk to me, Isaac," she said quietly. It seemed to Ike that she was unaffected by all the commotion the ship had become. She spread her arms out, and her long hair fluttered in the wind. She was smiling as if she wasn't afraid of anything. In the same second, the ship began to crash on the monstrous wave. Isaac couldn't tell if it was raining sideways or if the wind was just driving torrents of water across the deck. Either way, the rain almost froze him when it touched him. Why didn't the woman freeze? She had hardly any clothes on. And why wasn't she afraid? Ike was scared to death, and this was his ship. Why wasn't this woman afraid? And then it hit him. Recognition brought realization. Fear gave way to humility. Ike walked over to the railing beside her. "You're a juror, aren't you?" he asked. "I'm afraid I am," Noibrina smiled. You, he began. "Yes, Ike," she smiled. "I got here earlier this year. You know what that means, right? But that's not necessarily a bad thing." Ike sighed heavily and looked at the woman standing next to him. Something inside him told him that the thought running through his head would be unwelcome. "Even if I let you throw me overboard, Isaac, I won't die. I can't die, as you call it, because I'm not really alive, and I'll be pissed when I get up. I was hoping you were smarter than that." "What do I need to do?" Ike asked. "Go get your captain," she smirked. Ike walked slowly across the deck and back to the bridge. This time, he burst into the room with an expression of extreme fear on his face. All the officers in the room turned and looked at him. "What the hell are you doing, Ike?" Pittman shouted. "You should know better." "What's going on, Ike?" Captain Song asked. Ike, with a face as white as a sheet, replied, "Captain, it's a witch." "Ike, every sailor worth his salt knows what these storms are called and why," said Captain Song. "Pull yourself together before I send you to the brig." "No, Captain," Ike shouted. "It's really her, and she wants to see you. She's here on this damn ship, and if you don't talk to her, none of us will live to see the morning." "What in heaven's name are you talking about?" the captain asked. "The November Witch is not a person. That's the name of the storm. So tell that to the woman standing at the railing in the gale force winds like she just went for a walk on a sunny day in goddamn Florida," shouted Ike. "If you think I'm wrong, just go outside. You can always send me to the brig or fire me. Just get your ass out there and talk to her." Then, realizing he may have gone a little overboard, Ike added, "Sir," and raised his hand in a hasty salute. Captain Song walked over to a cabinet on the back wall of the bridge. He unlocked the cabinet and issued rifles to each of his officers. One of them, Tom Dooley, a big brawler, refused a rifle. "We're talking about a girl, aren't we?" he asked. Isaac nodded. "I don't need a gun," Dooley said. "If the need arises, I'll just throw it overboard." The captain, followed by 7 men armed with rifles, and the big man, Tom Dooley, left the bridge. Ike took this opportunity to get out of harm's way. "What are you doing on my ship?" Captain Song asked. Captain Song asked. The woman standing at the railing as Ike spoke turned and looked at the captain. The expression on her face said she was amused. "What is your ship doing in my sister's waters?" She snapped back. "Who are you?" snapped at the captain. "What kind of game are you playing?" "You already know who I am, Captain Song. Don't play the fool with me. Your boat might get a little wet," she smiled. "Mr. Dooley, put this woman in the brig until we find out what's going on here," the captain shouted. Tom Dooley headed toward the woman. As he raised his fist to grab her, she arched one eyebrow and raised one dainty finger. A gust of wind picked up the large man and lifted him into the air. He hung there, kicking and screaming, while the other men watched in shock. "You don't need men like him on your ship, Captain," Noibrina said. As if casually, she made a gesture and Dooley flew off the ship and landed almost 100 yards away in the icy water. Not even a shout was heard to mark his departure. The other men, without even waiting for the captain's reply, raised their rifles and fired. 7 bullets hit November in different parts of her body. The men stared at her, waiting, or rather hoping she would fall. There was a long moment of silence. She didn't fall or even stagger. But what she did do was look at the captain and speak again. "I tried to do it the easy way," she said, "but it seems you wouldn't let me. You came to my sister's waters and we welcomed you as guests. But no more. Before this night is over, Captain, I will get my way, one way or another, and now we will do it my way." The woman raised her arms and soared into the air in another gust of wind that the captain suddenly realized she had control over. She, he now realized, was the reason for the size of the waves and the temperature. As he realized his mistake, the waves got even bigger. The waves became like mountains of water rising from a lake. Looking at the woman floating in front of him, he realized that his ship would not be able to withstand such large waves. A wave nearly 50 feet high was bearing right on him. That wave would be the end of the ship and all the people on board. "What do you want?" the captain asked quietly. The wave immediately subsided and the lake became calm. Where only seconds ago the water had been churning at near Arctic temperatures, the lake was calm, with a hint of a barely cool breeze. "I see that whore," November said. "What whore?" the captain asked. "There are no women aboard my ship, no offense." "No offense taken," she said. "Call the entire crew to the deck." Captain Song ordered his officers to go throughout the ship and assemble the crew. There was no need to explain to them what was going on. Most of them already knew thanks to Ike. There were murmurs and whispers as they approached. More than one man clamped a hand over his mouth at the mention of the witch. Most of the brave men pressed themselves against the bulkheads, as far away from November as possible. "Gentlemen," she said, addressing everyone, "bear with me, this is new to me. I'm not used to dealing with people. Usually I just sink your little boats and drown you. Anyway, you can all leave here tonight healthy and awake. I don't intend to hurt any of you unless I have to. I only want the woman. But listen to me. Either she goes or you all do." "There is no woman aboard my ship," the captain growled. "I give you 10 minutes to make a decision," said Neubrina. The captain gathered with his crew. Talking and shouting could be heard. "I'm not going to die and leave my family without a breadwinner because of some whore," one of the crew members shouted. "What whore?" the captain asked. "The one that's been partying with everyone below deck since we left Michigan," replied another crew member. "Carl has been charging us money for her services," said another. "We can't in good conscience give an innocent woman to that thing," said the captain. "It would be unchristian." "That bitch is not innocent," snapped one of the crewmen. "Innocent women don't do that. Besides, Captain, a witch is not a Christian." "I'm getting bored," Nubrina chimed in. As she spoke, the wind picked up and the waves instantly got bigger. Before the captain could answer her, 3 men ran below deck and returned a few minutes later, dragging Ramona behind them. "No," the captain shouted. "You can't take her away. I'll have no part in it." "Ma'am, Miss Witch," one of the crewmen replied politely. "Do you want the captain too?" November seemed to ponder his question for a moment. The captain came to his senses and asked if Noya Brina wanted to put a woman in the boat. Noya Brina examined the woman carefully and intently. "I will take her as she is," said Noya Brina. Before Ramona could object, a gust of wind blew her off the deck into the air. November rose to follow her. "For this night and for the rest of the season, no harm will come to this ship anywhere on the lakes. Moreover, should any of the crew fall overboard in even the most turbulent water, they will be brought ashore safe and sound," she said in a voice like a gust of wind. Then she disappeared, leaving the crew to wonder if they had dreamed the whole thing. Ramona went down into the water, another woman beside her. She tried to swim, but the cold robbed her of her senses. She took one breath and held it as long as she could, then sank into the water. She felt the touch of hands and opened her eyes in shock to see the other woman beside her. She had no hope of seducing this woman. The woman grabbed her head viciously, and memories flashed before Ramona's eyes. She saw all the time she had spent tricking people out of their possessions. She remembered every lie she had ever told and every person she had ever cheated or ripped off. The most painful to her were the recent memories. When she saw herself with Cliff, she could practically feel his love for her, like a physical presence. She couldn't believe she had squandered such a jewel. In that moment, she realized what a hateful creature she was and how much better the world would be without her. Then a thought occurred to Ramona. It was as if someone else was speaking to her. She opened her eyes and saw that it was another woman. 36 years ago, I was you. That's why I became what I am now. To rid the world of creatures like you. Ramona nodded, feeling pain and shame at how she had squandered her life. And she had died. The icy water of the lake rushed into her lungs. Next chapter. Aboard the Maitland, Paul Pittman answered a radio message. Then he switched to the computer and emailed the photos. He was ready for this. Immediately after the women left the ship, the captain swore them to secrecy about what had happened. He also informed them that there were surveillance cameras on the dock, as always. He was confident that eventually the authorities would realize that the woman was aboard his ship. He had collected several photos and videos taken by his crew while the woman was on board. It was these that Paul sent to the Coast Guard and Detroit police. He informed them that the woman was discovered aboard the Maitland shortly after they left port. She had had a little too much to drink with the crew and had gotten very drunk during a Halloween party. They sent photos and videos proving that her actions were completely voluntary. Unfortunately, while intoxicated, she fell overboard. At that point, they were still looking for her. They called the Coast Guard and a boat was sent out to search for the body. It was a terrible accident, but nothing more. Since the captain did not know that there was a woman on board his vessel, he was only warned to be more careful with his vessel. It was also discovered that Tom Dooley was also missing during the storm and strong waves. Tom's body was never found. It was very strange, but the Coast Guard searched the vessel several times from stem to stern. Divers and search parties worked for over 2 weeks, but the body was never found. The police closed the case, and the Coast Guard, having exhausted all efforts to find the bodies, closed the case as well. Within weeks, all vessels in the Great Lakes region were put on alert, but the alert was in vain. There were no November storms that year. They all came only to one small region much earlier than usual, and everyone knew that no bodies would be found. The Gitche Gumi never parted with the dead when November came early. Sailors on the lakes were always afraid of November storms. Next chapter. 3 days after Halloween, Cliff Darden got into his Mustang and drove home. He knew it was home again, not just the empty house it had been when he was first released from the hospital. Sometimes strange things happen, and this one was for the best. Even though it had only been a few days, Cliff knew it was right. It was what he needed to fill the void in his life. When he opened the door, Janet jumped out to meet him. She wrapped her arms around him and hugged him as if her life depended on it. Maybe her life didn't, but her heart did. Their relationship was just beginning, but Janet was sure that Cliff was the man who would give her everything she wanted. A home, a man who would love her and treat her well, accept her love in return and maybe someday have children. That was what Janet wanted most of all. Cliff kissed her, and he felt good. He felt very good. The thought flashed through his mind that he had done this before with someone else, but this time it felt right. Almost 2 months later, John Lake walked out of the hospital. He could barely move. The doctors advised him to take it easy for a while, but he was sure to get better. He still had weeks of physical therapy ahead of him, but for the past 7 weeks he had been relentlessly moving toward recovery with only one thing on his mind. The day after Halloween, when the investigation into his neighbor's mysterious and forgetful wife was closed, and the policewoman assigned to his case had somehow become his girlfriend, another strange event occurred. Just a few hours after Cliff and Janet had left the hospital, and John was at the mercy of another attack of pain as his bones began to fuse, he had a visitor. At first he thought he was dreaming. It was a beautiful blonde-haired woman. "I think we started off on the wrong foot," she whispered. "I'm sorry I hurt you, but you pissed me off. When you get out of here, if you want to see me again, come to the water and call my name." She must have mistaken him for someone else. No woman had ever offended John. Perhaps it was a dream. John sprinted to his Mustang. He had to use his credit card to pay for parking because the car had been idling for a long time. He didn't expect it to start, but the pony car started right up. The powerful engine didn't even squeak. John wondered where he was going. He just got behind the wheel. He drove north, to where his people still had small settlements. These were not reservations, but small towns where people who still believed in the old ways lived. As he drove past one of the towns, he waved to a few people he knew from his childhood. "Hey John, you're back?" Several people asked warmly. "I don't know," he replied. "Maybe." John got out of the car and sat on a bench overlooking the big water. "November," he said. His voice was so low it was almost a whisper. He laughed to himself. I must be crazy to even think about it. As he laughed, the water bubbled and a figure emerged from it. It took you long enough, she said. I just got out of the hospital today, he replied. Do you like the new look? She asked. He nodded his head and enclosed her in a hug. Be careful not to piss me off, she smirked. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.